Hello and welcome to Chapter 10. Chapter 10 discusses the democratization of America and American politics, but also in American society in general. In the opening sort of years of the American Republic, uh, you see a lot of emphasis on ideals of equality and democracy, but ultimately, those in power, the sort of ruling classes, are basically elite. You still have widespread property qualifications for voting and various other things that keep access to politics, to democracy, within fairly elite circles. This chapter focuses on the period where those things start to disappear and you have much more participation from just ordinary Americans. Uh, you also start to see this same sort of democratization in society. You get it with a mass sort of popular religious movement, religious revival. You'll get it in the types of entertainment that are popular. And you'll also start to see some reform movements, which are sort of based loosely in this idea of democratization. These reform movements that began in the early 19th century, the period we're talking about, become the basis for the reform movements that characterize the later progressive movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which we discuss in chapter 21. So the Republican Party is suffering. The Republican Party is the only established party at the moment, and it's sort of caving under pressures generated, by industrialization, which is kind of taking hold of America. There's also some pressures over the spread of cotton and westward expansion, Americans moving into new territories, and those territories needing government. And this is putting a lot of strain on the Republican Party, essentially Jeffersonian Republican Party. Those with a preference for state rights ended up migrating over to the Democratic Party, which gets created in this era, and those that believed that the national government should encourage economic development became known as National Republicans, or more commonly referred to as Whigs. So you get the development of two new political parties out of the earlier Republican Party. Politicians had to adapt to the emerging democratic view of politics as well. Political democratization took a variety of different forms. States began to abolish property requirements for voting, which is probably one of the biggest moves in this direction. Private written ballots also began to replace voting aloud, and this made it easier for people to feel comfortable participating in the political process without fear of any kind of adverse repercussions for the way that they voted. Formerly appointed offices also now became elected offices, and it's in fact during this period that you see a lot of the state judiciary become elected offices rather than appointed, which was intended as a reform measure, but is perhaps questionable given the nature of the judiciary. Presidential electors were also now chosen by direct election rather than by state legislatures or other groups. You also start to see people learning the lessons of the past, the fierce battles that defined the elections between Federalists and Republicans, taught new politicians how to court voters, and both of them sought to expand their support. The Federalists, who had their stronghold in the North, were seeking to infiltrate the South, and by extension, the Republicans in the South were seeking some sort of headway into the North. Democratization was advanced by transportation and communication revolutions that created a much more politically informed public and allowed for this to be successful. There were still some limitations, however. Both parties were still generally organized from the top down in a kind of hierarchy. The parties also relied heavily on caucuses to nominate candidates, which involved sort of direct debate over the merits of candidates. And this democratization only extended to white male populations above a certain age. Women and free blacks generally remained disenfranchised. In 1824, sectional tensions definitely ended the era of good feelings when 5 Republican candidates vied for the presidency. The candidates were John Quincy Adams, who was favored in New England. John C. Calhoun and William Crawford vied for Southern support. Henry Clay and his American system were very popular in the West. And Andrew Jackson was popular in the South, but he was attractive to opponents of the American system in other areas like New England and Pennsylvania and New York. And he gained popularity even more so after the Panic of 1819 struck, because he was the only candidate not directly connected to the Monroe administration. Crawford was ultimately chosen as a presidential candidate, but a stroke knocked him out of the race quite early. Calhoun decided to pull out of the presidential race and to run unopposed for the vice presidential position. He was young at the time and figured that he could survive not being president this time around. In the popular vote, Andrew Jackson won the most votes, and he also won the most electoral votes, but he did not win a majority of either. And so the election had to be thrown to the House of Representatives, meaning that he didn't win at least 51% of votes from all the voters. He won more votes than his opponents, but not at least half. At least 51% to be a majority. In the House of Representatives, Henry Clay was a member, and he had been knocked out of the presidential race because he wasn't one of the top 2 candidates. The top 2 were John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. And so Clay threw his support behind Adams. And because he held a lot of sway in the House of Representatives, this ultimately meant that Adams won the race. Jackson and his supporters accused them of enacting a corrupt bargain. Improvement became the guiding principle for Adams' presidency, and further American progress through a sort of broad-gauge program of American development was his method that he chose to do this. This included improving public education, expanding communication and commerce, launching an ambitious program of federal improvements, and urging the participation in the first Pan-American Conference that would promote commerce with Latin America. This program, however, was met with growing political opposition. The strict constructionists opposed any internal improvements because it wasn't allowed for in the Constitution. Southerners protested participation in the Pan-American Conference because it included regimes that had abolished slavery. And the midterms, 1826, saw Adams' opponents take control of Congress, which would make Adams' job as president infinitely more difficult. This is exactly the situation that President Obama faced in 2010 when the Democrats lost control of Congress as well. As Adams' popularity was declining, Jackson's popularity was on the rise. He distrusted seasoned politicians, but he still remained a very popular hero. In 1828, his campaign began almost as soon as Adams took office in 1824. Supporters put together what is basically a modern political machine based on local committees and state conventions. And this represented the birth of a new political system, although few at the time realized its import. Martin Van Buren was the most alert to the change and had an uncanny ability to anticipate politics, and for this ability, he received the nickname the Little Magician. Van Buren was convinced that a two-party system was necessary for effective politics. Without the discipline imposed by an opposition party, the Republican Party very quickly fragmented in that period, somewhat ironically referred to as the era of good feelings. Van Buren realized that you needed two opposing parties so that there would be a clear winner. And the opposing parties, it would be helpful if they had clearly opposing views. The new Democratic Party was formed with Andrew Jackson at its head. And it was with this arrangement that the parties move into the election of 1828. The election of 1828 was a vicious affair. There was mudslinging on both sides of the aisle. Both of them participating, but Jackson's people had a little bit better aim than Adams. Adams' people accused Jackson of being an illiterate backwoodsman, but that backfired, as it only served to increase his popularity by casting him as a common man, which the common voter could identify with. In actuality, Jackson was a wealthy slaveholder, but people wanted to see him as the idealized common man, uncorrupt, natural, plain, and Jackson's campaign, led by Van Buren, capitalized on that desire. Jackson won the election by more than twice the electoral vote that Adams had. However, the popular vote was much closer. So Jackson's first target as president was to attack the corruption and privilege in the civil service. Many believed, as well as Jackson, that these jobs were entitlements. And Jackson supported rotation in office so that as many common people as possible would have a chance to work in government. Although it is very unlikely that any common people were actually recommended to these jobs under Jackson. He did go about firing nearly half the civil service when he got into office and replaced them with his supporters, which his critics very quickly dubbed as the spoil system, the idea of rewarding someone for their political support by giving them a political office. His position on internal improvements and tariffs sparked even more controversy. He didn't actually oppose all federal aid to internal improvements. He suspected officials of using the aid to win political support by handing out favors, and so he flatly rejected federal support for roads within states. However, things that affected across state lines, he was less inclined to be critical of. Issues over the tariff tested his support in the South. While Adams was still in office, some of Jackson's supporters in Congress helped to pass a very high protective tariff that strongly favored Western agriculture and New England manufacturing to the disadvantage of a lot of the South. Although it would be blamed on Adams, Southerners leveled their anger directly at Andrew Jackson. The Tariff of 1828 opened a major rift between Jackson and his vice president, John C. Calhoun. Initially, Calhoun was a nationalist, but by the 1820s, he became a states' rights sectionalist. He supported the tariff in 1816 to protect the fledgling industry and support military preparedness, but by 1826, national defense was no longer a major priority, and the industries no longer needed this kind of stringent protection. Calhoun also wanted to be president, and he planned on succeeding Jackson. And in order to maintain support in the South, which was growing more and more opposed to tariffs, he also became more and more opposed to tariffs. Tariffs, Southerners argued, drove up the prices of manufacturers' goods and threatened to damage the American market for British textiles, and therefore drive down the demand for Southern cotton. Many in the South also feared that if government could pass laws on tariffs favoring one section over another, then they may also be able to meddle with the institution of slavery, upon which the entire Southern economic system was built. Calhoun objected based on the Constitution. He supported the ideas behind the Kentucky and Virginia resolves that were written, if you recall, by James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. And he anonymously wrote South Carolina's exposition and protest, arguing that aggrieved states had the right to nullify a law passed down from the federal government within their own state borders. Personal antagonism also widened the divide between the president and the vice president. As president, Jackson needed to retain support in pro-tariff states and soothe the South, and so he developed basically two policies. The first was to distribute federal surplus among the states, hoping that it would remove the taint of sectional injustice from the tariff and force the federal government to restrict its own spending, but also reduce the tariff. In 1832, Congress passed a slightly reduced tariff, but this didn't turn out to be satisfactory for South Carolina. The stage is now set for what becomes known as the Nullification Crisis, which was a direct clash between Calhoun and Jackson. In November of 1832, a South Carolina convention voted to nullify the tariffs of 1828 and 1832 and forbade the collections of custom duties within the state. Jackson denounced the nullifiers as unprincipled men who would rather rule hell than be subordinate in heaven, and in December of 1832 issued a proclamation promising South Carolina further tariff reductions, but condemning nullification as unconstitutional. In March of 1833, Jackson signed two new measures into law. The first of these was a compromise tariff, which provided for a gradual reduction of duties over time. And the second was the Force Bill, which authorized the president to use arms to collect customs duties in South Carolina. The compromise tariff was one of many accommodations which pulled the Union from one sectional crisis to the next. Henry Clay was largely responsible for the compromise, as in fact he's largely responsible for most of the compromises which do this job. He generally favored high tariffs, but supported the reductions for two important reasons. First, he feared that without some concessions, the Force Bill would result in an open war. And without compromise, the basic principle of protective tariff would be lost. Henry Clay was in fact nicknamed the Great Compromiser, and ultimately made the hero of the hour, probably much to the dismay of Jackson, who didn't particularly like Henry Clay. So Jackson recognized that there was a widening gap between rich and poor in the 1820s and 30s. He felt that wealth earned through hard work was perfectly acceptable, but wealth which was gained through privileges secured from a corrupt legislature was not acceptable. His own unfortunate dealings left him with something of a sour taste in his mouth about banks. The Bank of the United States had been given a 20-year charter in 1816, and the bank had the ability to restrain state banks from excessive printing or lending, and that power provoked a considerable amount of hostility from state banks, and many blamed the Bank of the United States for the Panic of 1819. Bank stockholders were private citizens, and the bank itself was in Philadelphia rather than in Washington, D.C. Encouraged by Henry Clay, the bank president Nicholas Biddle secured the passage of a bill that would recharter the Bank of the United States, but Jackson vetoed it. Clay couldn't get Congress to override the veto, and so pinned his hopes on winning the presidency himself in 1832. Jackson made his views on the issues very clear and very easily managed to win a second term as president in 1832, and that set the stage for the controversy that would surround the Bank of the United States. Jackson's bank veto ignited a storm of controversy which gave rise to an opposition party, stimulated popular interest in politics, and gave rise to a financial panic which would strike in 1837. Jackson could have let the bank die quietly in 1836 when its charter ran out, but he feared the bank's power far too much to do that. Biddle began calling in bank loans and contracted credit offered in anticipation of further attacks on his institution. Jackson retaliated by removing federal deposits from the Bank of the United States and placing them in a select number of state banks, or pet banks as they became known. This ultimately backfired because as state banks became depositories for federal revenue, they began printing more paper money and extending loans to farmers and speculators, thus producing exactly the kind of economy which Jackson sought to avoid. They wanted to limit the number of state banks initially, but all of the state banks wanted to get in on being a federal depository, and so the number of them grew, and Jackson felt like he couldn't control the situation any longer. Some Democrats disliked the state banks because they occasionally are the state bank, the national bank, because it occasionally contracted credit and restricted the lending by the smaller state banks. And so they pressured Jackson into signing the Deposit Act, which would increase the number of deposit banks and loosen federal control over them. Hoping to kind of stem the tide and reverse the damaging effects of the Deposit Act, Jackson issued the Specie Circular, which required that anyone hoping to purchase Western land needed to do so using specie, meaning hard currency, gold or silver, and not bank credit notes. During his second term in office, the new Whig Party formed in response to his opposition of federal measures to stimulate the economy. The Democrats saw growth tied to geographic expansion, whereas the Whigs saw it as tied to the burgeoning market revolution. The South was very strongly Democratic, but the Whigs were making some gains. Southerners who simply opposed Jackson fell in with the Whigs. Nullifiers, those who didn't benefit from the distribution of federal surplus, and those that feared the lack of support for internal improvements would further harm the development of the South as a region, all tended to fall in with the Whigs. Northern social reformers also strengthened the opposition to Jackson. Reformers were drawn to the Whigs because of their willingness to use government intervention to improve society, which was exactly what the reformers were hoping to do themselves. Nativists were also strongly drawn to the Whig Party, as well as those who were anti-Mason. Here we have a cartoon which is very popular, actually, and depicts Jackson's struggle with the Bank of the United States. Jackson didn't trust banks generally because he had, as I said before, had some deals that went sour, and he blamed the financial system. However, Jackson also didn't particularly understand finances very well, and his scorn for expert advice and confidence in his own flawed knowledge of the system ultimately led to his fight against the bank, which proved to be somewhat imprudent of a fight to wage. But here you have a cartoon which is possibly somewhat difficult to figure out exactly whose side it's taking. On the left, you have Andrew Jackson, who in his sort of fervor has lost his top hat, and he's swinging his cane at this sort of many-headed monster. If you look really closely, you can see that on his cane is written the word veto, which was, of course, what he used to ultimately stop the rechartering of the bank. The heads on the beast represent various members of Congress and other people who supported the rechartering of the bank. And the gentleman in the middle of the monster, the kind of sort of timid-looking gentleman in the middle, represents Nicholas Biddle, who was the president of the Bank of the United States. Unfortunately, the writing on the cartoon is too small to make out, but you can get some idea here of what the artist was attempting to say through this cartoon, even without reading the words. It's very likely that the cartoon was probably more pro-Jackson than pro the bank, because the bank is represented as a many-headed monster. But it's not particularly unflattering to people like Nicholas Biddle, who isn't sort of caricatured or made fun of, as far as the picture can tell either. In 1836, the Whigs were a national party with widespread appeal, but it would become problematic because the party didn't look the same from one state to the next. Jackson's popularity, however, was a tough act to follow for his Democratic successor, Martin Van Buren. The Whig Party was much less cohesive and produced 3 candidates to oppose Van Buren. The Democrats accused the Whigs of doing it intentionally so that the election would be thrown to the House of Representatives again, but in reality, the Whigs were just that divided, and Van Buren was able to win a clear majority. Van Buren's first test came early, when the financial panic struck in 1837. A speculative boom of 1835 and 36 doubled the total number of banks and tripled the value of banknotes in circulation, and land prices began to soar as well. A lot of states made new committees to build costly canals, mostly on money that was borrowed. In May of 1837, prices began to freefall, and banks began to stop all specie payments. Finances rallied, but then crashed again in 1839, and the Bank of the United States, now operating as a state bank, failed, and Nicholas Biddle was arrested for fraud and theft. The banks again suspended specie payments, and the following depression was far worse than the one that had been previously experienced in 1819. Those that were still working had their wages slashed, and Van Buren needed to confront the depression that was damaging both his citizens and his party. In response to this, he created the Independent Treasury, which would hold federal deposits and keep them out of the banks. It failed, however, to address the underlying banking issue on the state level. The Whigs blamed Jackson and his specie circular instead of the banks, and so encouraged bank charters to spur economic development. The Democrats, on the other hand, blamed the banks and abandoned paper money in favor of hard money stance. But despite the Depression, the Democrats renominated Van Buren as their presidential candidate in 1840. The Whigs, however, learned their lesson, and they settled on William Henry Harrison and John Tyler as their presidential and vice presidential candidates. The Democrats ridiculed Harrison as an old granny who spent his declining years sipping cider in a log cabin, and this gave the Whigs the perfect PR symbol. They used the now famous political slogan, "Tippecanoe and Tyler too," referencing William Henry Harrison's victory at the Battle of Tippecanoe early on in his career. And their campaign headquarters were quite often located in log cabins. At campaign events, they would give away free hard cider, which was inducement enough for a lot of voters. And so Harrison won a very clear victory. But the Depression would likely have ensured that any Democratic candidate would find it difficult to be elected. The election ushered in a significant long-term trend in voting. The popular vote expanded by 60% in 1840. The Depression and the rather noisy log cabin campaign brought voters to the polls in droves, and moving forward, politicians increasingly would present clear alternatives to voters, which would stimulate an enduring popular interest in politics. So you also have, along with the democratization of politics, you also get this kind of wave happening in other areas of human interaction. And this is exemplified as well in the rise of popular religions. The Second Great Awakening, as it was referred to, or as it is now referred to, I suppose, was ignited first in Connecticut in the 1790s and swept over the country throughout the next sort of half century or so. Educated Congregationalists and Presbyterians tended to dominate this revival, and they spread it to frontier states like Kentucky and Tennessee. where it underwent changes as a result of the sort of Western way of doing things. These changes are typified by the use of camp meetings. And among the more extreme features were exercises, which required actual sort of physical exercises. The early revivals fundamentally challenged some of the more traditional religious customs. No denomination in this second movement was as successful as the Methodists. And in 1844, they became the largest Protestant denomination in the country. This group emphasized that religion was a matter of heart as opposed to head, and they tended to prefer traveling ministers who preached in houses or in open fields rather than established churches. By the 1820s, the center of the revival had shifted to the western region of New York, a region which became known as the Burned Over District. This area was filled with the descendants of early Puritans and people who were drawn to the region in order to work on the canal, and those in search of wealth, made the region sort of ripe for both high expectations as well as a certain amount of bitter discontent. People who were away from family and their traditional influences and were particularly susceptible to these evangelical religious revivals. Charles Finney was a Presbyterian minister who conducted dozens of these revivals all along the Erie Canal, rather. His greatest success was in Rochester, New York, where a citywide revival had participation from numerous denominations that employed new devices for speeding up conversions as well. He rejected the sort of Calvinistic doctrine of innate depravity, which tended to typify the first Great Awakening. Sin, he argued, was a voluntary act, and that a sinner could scold a sinner can will themselves away from sin, and even had the power to lead perfect lives. And this concept was referred to as theological perfectionism. It was successful because he told 19th century Americans exactly what they wanted to hear, that they were in control of their own destinies. And it sort of fit with the other political and social movements that were gripping this period in America. Women were also a major reason for the revivalist success because they were major participants in these new revivals too. The revivals did draw some criticism in the form of the Unitarian movement. Unitarians openly doubted that they produced any sort of permanent change in behavior and generally did not believe in the divine nature of Jesus, but rather that he was a human model for a moral life. The Unitarians had relatively few followers outside of the New England area, but the tendency to attract the wealthy and educated meant that they did have influence beyond their rather small numbers. Moral goodness, the argument was, comes from a gradual process of character building rather than from some sort of divine intervention, if you like. One of the more controversial new denominations were the Mormons. This group was founded by Joseph Smith, who, as a boy, dreamed of finding buried treasure and quite often wrestled with religious uncertainty. As an adult, he reported that an angel came to him in a dream and told him the location of a hidden book of Revelation and gave him the ability to translate it. Smith's claim to a new revelation guaranteed a hostile response from pretty much every other religious denomination in America, and he and his followers were constantly being relocated further and further westward because of essentially conflict arising between them and the more established religious traditions. They began in New York, but soon moved west to Illinois, where they built a city called Nauvoo. However, in 1844, a group of dissident Mormons accused Smith and his inner circle of polygamous marriages. Smith destroyed the newspaper press, and the militia had to move in and restore order. Smith and his brother were arrested and put in jail in Carthage, where they were eventually killed by a lynch mob. This kind of persecution convinced Smith that the survival of Mormonism required a separation from American society, and that idea was shared by Brigham Young, who eventually took over the group and ultimately moved them out to the Utah Territory and established what is now Salt Lake City. And I suppose, the sort of epicenter, if you like, of the Mormon faith. The Shakers were also a prominent group that sort of came into popularity during the Second Great Awakening. They were founded by Mother Ann Lee and believed that she was the second incarnation of God. They were called the Shakers because of their convulsive dancing during group worship, and they established a number of communities whose purpose was the pursuit of religious perfection. As a group, they practiced celibacy and carefully segregated the sexes and relied on converts to grow their numbers. They practiced a form of Christian socialism where they would pool their resources for community gain. However, the communities weren't successful in the long term, and ultimately the Shakers died out. The spirit of improvement that drove the spiritual revival also influenced the rise of reform movements, which sought to improve society. The early 19th century Americans were heavy drinkers, usually consuming around 7 gallons per capita of alcohol annually, usually in the form of whiskey or hard cider. To give you some context, the average American today drinks about 2 gallons of alcohol annually, more often than not beer and wine, rather than spirits. Heavy drinking produced a host of social problems, including things like domestic violence, economic failure, and disease, among others. And early temperance movements advocated moderation of consumption rather than complete prohibition. In 1826, though, the American Temperance Society became the first national organization to demand total abstinence, and by 1834, the organization had around 5,000 local affiliates. The primary strategy was to encourage individuals to take the pledge not to consume alcohol. The laboring classes were the main targets, as factories demanded more and more disciplined and sober workforces. Industrial employers were also quick to embrace temperance, refusing to allow employees to drink while on the job, and taking away the kind of traditional dram of whiskey that came as part of your wages. Workers initially showed very little interest, somewhat understandably, in taking the pledge, but the financial panic of 1837 convinced a lot of people that their economic survival depended also on their sobriety. As the temperance movement won support, some began to demand legal prohibition as well, banning the sale of liquor on the state and local level. Of course, it wouldn't be until the early 20th century that legal action on a federal level would come about. Another area of popular reform in the 19th century was in education. Typical school in the early 19th century was the sort of rural one-room schoolhouse. Students learned reading and counting and spent only a few months each year in school. Teachers were usually recent college graduates who took jobs temporarily before moving on to bigger and better things. Rural parents expected very little of the education of their children. Basic literacy was pretty much all that they required. And as they needed them to work on the farm and to help support the family, that was really all they had time to support as well. Reformers wanted education to equip students to survive in the growing industrial society that was coming to dominate, or that many could see would come to dominate American society. The strategies for pushing this kind of education included things like shifting financial responsibility from the families to the state, extending the school term so that students attended for longer, more months out of the year, standardizing textbooks so that students were learning the same thing from one school to the other, dividing students into grades in order to make it easier to differentiate the students that had moved up and learned more from the students who were just starting. And compulsory attendance also was focused on. Educational reformers sought to spread industrial values like punctuality and competition through schools as well. However, these reformers faced a lot of challenges from parents who needed children for agricultural labor, from Catholics who objected to the arguably anti-Catholic bias of public schools, and from the laboring poor who needed their children to go to work and earn wages to support the family. Reform prevailed in the North, at least because opposition failed to organize, and also because they had influential allies. You also found support from those who felt that the schools could be used to Americanize new immigrants, and that would become a major feature as well in the post-Civil War period. The anti-slavery movement flourished in the Revolutionary period, but was in decline in the early decades in the 19th century. The American Colonization Society proposed a limited plan for emancipation with compensation given to slaveholders and colonizing the newly freed slaves in Liberia, a colony that had just been established in Africa. This plan, however, had very little hope of becoming a reality as the South became more and more enthralled by cotton as their commercial cash crop, and as a result, ever more dependent on slavery as a labor force. Most African Americans also opposed colonization, however, as they had only ever known America and had very little interest in going back to Africa. Black Americans began to form their own abolition societies, and in 1830 began holding annual conventions devoted to abolition and ending discrimination. There were also some white abolitionists that began to move towards more radical positions. For example, William Lloyd Garrison launched a newspaper called The Liberator and very quickly established himself as the most prominent and provocative white abolitionist. He formed the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1833 and demanded immediate emancipation with compensation to slaveholders and full economic and political equality for freed slaves. He knew that Americans needed to recognize slavery as an intolerable evil and quickly gained support from black abolitionists. However, his fellow white Americans were less inclined to jump on board unreservedly. Fugitive slaves also played a central role in the abolitionist movement. Frederick Douglass would travel the country and give lectures. He also published an autobiography to sort of shed light on the life of slaves. Relations between black and white abolitionists were not always harmonious, however. A lot of white abolitionists opposed full equality and sometimes even excluded black abolitionists from their own meetings. Like the temperance reformers, they drew on the language of the revivals, condemning slavery as a sin. Protestant clergy didn't rally behind the cause, however. Issues of strategy and tactics also served to divide the abolitionists. Those like Garrison and his followers came to reject all participation in party politics and even in government, as long as that government allowed slavery. Other abolitionists were much more reasonable, or perhaps the better phrase is much less extreme, and they were willing to work from within the current political system in order to effect a change. This was the standpoint of people like Frederick Douglass. The role of women also created divisions. From the outset, women actively participated through a separate women's auxiliary. Angelina and Sarah Grimke undertook speaking tours and received criticism, claiming that such conduct was indelicate or unfeminine. Some abolitionists dismissed female efforts outright. And women like Angelina and Sarah Grimke, as well as others like Lucretia Mott, took up the sauce of women's rights as a result of their experiences within the abolition movement. They not only defended their right to participate in the abolition movement, but also drew on similarities between themselves and slaves. Female abolitionists who took up women's rights declared themselves in sisterhood with the female slaves. In the early 19th century, American women couldn't vote. They couldn't hold public office. They couldn't access higher education. Married women had no legal identity. Divorced women could not gain custody of their children. And even domestic violence was addressed only as a side issue under the banner of temperance. Separate spheres also tended to confine women to the house. Reform movements provided middle-class women with new opportunities to work in public. However, it wasn't openly a rejection of the private sphere. Some women justified their reform activities as being on behalf of family protection, but did serve as well to undercut their legal rights. Women's movement openly challenged gender-based double standards. In 1848, leaders Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton organized the Seneca Falls Convention for Women's Rights. And from that convention, we received the Declaration of Sentiments, which began with the assertion that all men and women are created equal. The attendees of the convention also passed 12 resolutions, with only suffrage receiving any opposition at all. After the Civil War, suffrage became the main demand of the women's movement. Beginning in the 1820s, reformers also began to combat poverty, crime, and insanity by establishing new institutions based on new theories about the roots of deviancy. One investigator concluded that poverty stemmed from poor home environments rather than innate sinfulness. Human nature can be improved through placement in proper moral environments, and thus you have the creation of the asylum. The penitentiary also was intended to lead criminals to a penitential reformation by isolating them and encouraging them to contemplate their guilt, often requiring the inmates to spend a lot of time in solitary confinement. Asylums were usually designed for the poor and mentally ill, and practiced indoor relief, which was confining the infirm poor in almshouses and the able poor in workhouses. Instead of imprisoning the insane in jails and sheds, humanitarian reformer Dorothea Dix argued for housing them in orderly hospitals where they could receive proper medical and moral care. All of these efforts reflected the belief that the solution for deviancy lay in proper moral environments. The reformist belief in the possibility of human perfection assumed its most pure expression in the emergence of utopian communities. Most of these communities aimed at offering alternatives to the selfish excesses of social and economic competition. In 1825, one British industrialist, Robert Owen, founded the New Harmony community. He believed that if social arrangements could be perfected, then vice and misery would disappear, because the human character is formed entirely by the environment. Community then became a magnet for idlers and fanatics and failed ultimately within 2 years, but his ideas still survived. Religious philosophers, the Transcendentalists, established Brook Farm near Boston and sought to revitalize Christianity by proclaiming the infinite spiritual capacities of ordinary men and women. The most controversial of these utilitarian communities, or utopian communities rather, was the Oneida community, which was established by the theological perfectionist John Humphrey Knowles. He advocated a form of Christian communism that challenged conventional notions of religion, property, gender roles, and even clothing and child rearing. The most upsetting to critics was the application of communism to marriage, where those in the Oneida community practiced what was called complex marriage, in which every member of the community was married to every other member of the other sex, which sounds probably a lot more exciting than it actually was.